The granite in the Great Pyramid, if you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are, the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Over 4,000 years ago, ancient workers seem to have carved through solid granite using a technology that should not have existed in the Bronze Age. The core is still on display at London's Petrie Museum, and Graham Hancock argued on the Joe Rogan podcast that most archaeologists have failed to answer how this was even possible in ancient times. Scientists openly called his ideas harmful to public understanding of archaeology. Joe Rogan was intrigued but also wanted to know who is right. So why does Graham insist on this? Join us now as we take a closer look.
I think we're looking again at a lost technology, and it was this ancient apocalypse 12,800 years ago that wiped that from the human memory banks.
The Granite Mystery. Graham Hancock begins his case in 1881, about 145 years ago, back when a British engineer named Flinders Petrie stepped into the King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid. He wasn't searching for treasure, but for important marks left by ancient builders from the time period he was studying. What he found was unbelievable. Broken drill cores and cut pieces of granite were still lying on the chamber floor, apparently left behind by workers more than 4,000 years ago. Petrie also noticed something interesting. Unlike most other parts of the pyramid built mainly from limestone, the King's Chamber was made almost entirely of granite, a much harder stone that was hauled more than 500 miles from Aswan. The walls were granite, along with the ceiling beams and even the stone coffin. Everything was carved from granite. The choice itself wasn't surprising. After all, granite is far stronger than limestone, making it the obvious material for a chamber supporting the immense weight of the pyramid above. Yet that practical decision also created a mystery, one that still hasn't been solved today. Egypt had abundant limestone that was soft, local, and easy to quarry. Granite was the exact opposite. The quartz crystals inside it rank about 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, while copper, the Egyptians' primary metal, ranks only about 3. And that gap sits at the heart of Hancock's argument. Everyone, including Hancock and mainstream Egyptologists, agrees the builders chose granite because it was stronger. The disagreement begins with how they worked it. The granite coffin inside the King's Chamber contains remarkably sharp inside corners, and later measurements suggested that some surfaces were flat to within just a few thousandths of an inch. According to Hancock, that's a level of precision Bronze Age copper tools shouldn't have been able to achieve, and the coffin isn't even his strongest piece of evidence. Flinders Petrie, the man who started it all, also measured the spiral groove on one of the granite drill cores. It suggested a feed rate of about 0.1 inch per revolution, far faster than Petrie believed Bronze Age technology could manage. More than a century later, Hancock made those measurements central to his argument, claiming mainstream archaeology has never fully explained them. So is he right, or is he overlooking something important? Mainstream experts say Egyptian craftsmen used copper tools together with quartz sand as an abrasive, grinding through granite rather than cutting it directly. They also point to dolerite hammerstones found at Giza, and they insist these tools were used to rough shape the stone before the finer work. That is the explanation accepted by most archaeologists today, but Hancock strongly disagrees with their conclusions. So who is right about this, Hancock or the mainstream consensus on this matter? To answer this question, we'll have to closely examine Hancock's case exactly as he presents it in his books, and from there, we'll see whether the evidence really supports his conclusions or whether mainstream archaeology has the stronger argument. But before we unpack it, thank you so much for watching this far. Please consider liking and subscribing. We appreciate your time and attention. So without further ado, let's fully explore his theory. Hancock's theory. Hancock's argument begins with one main idea. The granite is not just one strange mystery. Rather, he insists it is just one piece of a much bigger pattern that experts have refused to take seriously. His main theory, explained in his books like Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995 and Magicians of the Gods in 2015, is that an advanced civilization existed before the last ice age ended. He believes this came from around 12,800 years ago, and all their advancements and technologies were destroyed by a global disaster. Graham Hancock believes the survivors of this event spread across the ancient world and shared parts of their knowledge, including farming, huge stone building, and astronomy, with later cultures that we usually credit with creating those ideas on their own. Those people and cultures he refers to include ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the very first known civilizations in Mesoamerica and the Andes as well. The disaster itself is the center of his theory, and he has added more details to it over the last 30 years. Hancock supports the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which says pieces of a breaking comet struck Earth around 10,900 BC. He says this caused a sudden return to Ice Age weather that lasted about 1,200 years, brought huge floods as giant ice sheets melted quickly and helped wipe out many large animals across North America. He points to a special layer of soil found at many places around the world, often called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. Experts supporting this idea say it contains unusual amounts of nanodiamonds, platinum, and other materials that match what could be left behind after an object from space hits Earth. Hancock treats this accepted theory as physical proof that the event happened, even though many geologists still disagree. It is at this point his claims get interesting. Hancock says the sudden disappearance of North America's Clovis culture and many giant animals at nearly the same time supports this timeline instead of being only a coincidence. He then argues that flood stories found in many different cultures, from old Utnapishtim in Mesopotamia to Noah's Ark and flood stories from Mesoamerica and the Andes, are not separate stories made up by different people. He believes they are shared memories pointing to the same historical disaster, passed down by word of mouth for thousands of years before writing existed. From there, Hancock builds his case one side at a time, treating each place as another piece of physical evidence instead of one single claim. He points to the Great Sphinx at Giza and the deep vertical weathering marks on the walls around it. This idea was first suggested by geologist Robert Schoch, after Hancock and researcher John Anthony West invited him to study the site in person. Schoch, followed by Hancock, says those marks look like they were made by long periods of heavy rainfall, the kind of weather Egypt has not seen since long before 5000 BC. If that is true, then it would also mean the Sphinx is thousands of years older than the 4th dynasty date accepted by Egyptologists. Hancock calls this his strongest piece of physical evidence because it depends only on how rocks wear away over time, not on old stories or ancient objects. His next major proof for his theory points to Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. This huge site has giant carved stone pillars, many arranged in circles and covered with animal carvings. It has been reliably dated to around 9,600 BC. Mainstream archaeology agrees that this site is older than farming and was built by hunter-gatherers before permanent villages or pottery existed there. Hancock uses it to argue that people were building giant monuments thousands of years earlier than experts once believed possible. He says that if archaeology was wrong once about the earliest date for large building projects at Göbekli Tepe, then there is no reason to assume today's timeline is correct everywhere else. Yet his theory is far from over. Graham Hancock also points to Gunung Padang in Indonesia, a stepped stone site built on a hillside. In 2023, geologist Danny Hillman Nadawijaja and his team published a paper saying that many things like ground-penetrating radar and rock samples showed buried layers much deeper than the visible structure. Some of those deeper layers were radiocarbon that are dated to tens of thousands of years ago. He presented that paper as support for his larger theory, saying it showed building activity older than any known civilization. Afterwards, several archaeologists argued that the dated material was simply natural volcanic soil and not proof of human construction at those depths. Hancock says that reaction supports his argument about bias in the field instead of proving the claim wrong. He also carries the same idea into South America, pointing to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. He often refers to an older dating method suggested in the early 1900s by researcher Arthur Poznański. Why so? You see, Poznański studied the alignment of the Kalasasaya platform with the stars and believed the site could be more than 14,000 years old instead of about 1,500 years old, which is the age accepted today by archaeologists. That older date has been rejected for many years, but Hancock argues Poznański's method was dismissed instead of fully disproved. He also points to the carefully cut stone blocks at Pumapunku, with their matching shapes and exact measurements, saying they show the same unusual level of skill he sees at Giza. Because Egypt and the Andes are so far apart, Hancock believes the similarities point to a shared source of knowledge instead of two separate civilizations solving the same problems on their own. He also includes the Petrie race map, an Ottoman map made in 1513. Hancock says part of its southern coastline looks like Antarctica, including land hidden today beneath thick ice. Using a theory that was first suggested by college professor Charles Hapgood, whose 1958 book about shifting Earth's crust received a written note of support from Albert Einstein, Hancock argues that the map copied information from a much older civilization that mapped Antarctica before it eventually got covered by ice. He even suggests Antarctica could have been the home of his lost civilization because it fits the timeline in his flood stories and comet impact theory. Hancock also points to the inside of the Great Pyramid. He talks about the narrow shafts leading from the King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber toward the outside. These passages are far too small for people to crawl through. He refers to studies saying they line up with certain stars, including Orion's belt and Sirius, as they appeared when the pyramid was built. He says those alignments were planned on purpose and were not simply decoration or chance. To Hancock, they show a level of careful astronomy that does not fit a civilization supposedly building its first giant monuments from the beginning. He also mentions the inventory stela, a stone found near the Great Sphinx that describes the Sphinx as already ancient during Khufu's rule. Hancock argues that Egyptologists mostly treat the writing as symbolic because accepting it as true would disagree with the accepted building date. He sees this as another example of evidence being changed to fit the timeline instead of letting the timeline change to fit the evidence. When it comes to the granite itself, Hancock's argument is actually much smaller than the rest of his theory, and it connects directly back to it. He does not say his lost civilization built the pyramids. Instead, he argues that survivors of that older civilization passed on their knowledge of engineering and astronomy to the early Egyptians. He believes the precision of the granite work, the pyramid's almost perfect alignment with true north, accurate to only a small part of a degree, and the star positions suggested for the Giza complex all show knowledge that did not begin with the Egyptians, who are usually given all the credit. He also points to the Orion correlation theory, developed with researcher Robert Bauval. This idea says the three main pyramids match the position of Orion's belt as it appeared around 10,500 BC. Not around 2500 BC, when the pyramids are believed to have been built. Hancock sees this as another clue that the site remembers a much older time. Hancock also says the disagreement is not only about the evidence, but about archaeology itself. He argues that Egyptology and archaeology are built around a slow, step-by-step model of human history, sometimes called the standard model of prehistory. He believes that mainstream scientists have a habit of naturally rejecting evidence that does not fit that timeline instead of studying it fairly. Hancock points to the fact that he has no archaeology degree and has never worked as an academic archaeologist. He says that is used against him instead of letting the evidence speak for itself. He argues that people should not need special credentials before asking serious questions, and that archaeology has changed its timeline before when discoveries forced it to, using Göbekli Tepe as an example. With all this as proof, he produced and presented his case in a viral 2022 Netflix docu-series titled Ancient Apocalypse. How was it received by the public? And are there reasons not to believe his claims at all? The scholarly response and consensus. Graham's viral docu-series grew popular around the world, and it also brought strong criticism almost right away. The Society for American Archaeology published a public letter that year saying the series could mislead people about archaeology. Hancock, on the other hand, answered by saying the strong negative reaction from mainstream scholars actually proved his point. He argued that when a whole academic group responds to one documentary series, it looks less like science correcting mistakes and more like an institution protecting its own ideas. Graham Hancock has repeated that view in many public debates, especially during a long, intense discussion with famous mainstream archaeologist Flint Dibble on Joe Rogan's podcast in 2024. There, Hancock said his goal is not to prove a final answer, but to encourage archaeology to take another look at evidence he believes is too often ignored. Hancock has also addressed the way many newspapers and websites describe him. He rejects the word pseudo-archaeologist. He says he has never claimed his lost civilization had modern technology like electricity, advanced machines, or anything close to today's science. Instead, he believes they were unusually skilled at farming, sailing, building huge stone monuments, and studying the stars much earlier than the accepted timeline allows. He says critics often make his ideas sound much more extreme, turning them into stories about Atlantis, spaceships, aliens, and magic. According to Hancock, critics likely do this because those versions are easier to dismiss than the real arguments found across hundreds of pages in his books. He also says he presents his ideas as a hypothesis based on many different kinds of evidence, not as proven fact beyond reasonable doubt. According to Hancock, treating his theory as if he claims it is already proven is another way his position gets misunderstood and attacked. That is Hancock's argument, backed, according to him, by a huge amount of evidence. A worldwide disaster reported by multiple religions and historical sources around 10,900 BC, a lost civilization that did not survive it, scattered survivors who passed on advanced but pre-industrial knowledge, and a chain of physical sites, from the Sphinx to Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang, Puma Punku, the star-lined shafts, and the granite in the Great Pyramid. He believes these are connected parts of the same story, and mainstream archaeologists haven't fully addressed the mystery left wide open without his theory. Yet, as we'll see, the mystery does not end inside that single room. Travel south to Saqqara and down into the Serapam, an underground burial place built for sacred bulls, and you will find a hallway lined with giant granite boxes weighing around 70 tons each. They were hollowed out with walls that stayed almost the same thickness all the way around and polished smooth inside, even though almost nobody would ever see or judge that work. Travel farther and you will find giant obelisks, each carved from one huge block of granite, lifted upright and covered from top to bottom with hieroglyphs cut into a stone that quickly wears down an ordinary chisel. Every one of them came from the quarries near Aswan, floated down the Nile during flood season, and moved as over 70-ton blocks more than 500 years before iron tools existed as standard in Egypt. Flinders Petrie walked out of that chamber in 1881 with more questions than answers, and surprisingly, many of those questions are still being asked today. So how did a Bronze Age civilization cut, hollow, and polish one of the hardest common stones on Earth? Mainstream experts believe they used it with the tools available at the time, but Hancock insists that using tools mostly made of copper isn't good enough to produce the things found in that room from 145 years ago. Yet Hancock wasn't the only one who refused to buy the major scientific consensus on this matter. One famous engineer named Christopher Dunn took the idea even further, but his claims felt absurd from the get-go. Back in the 1990s, he suggested that a vibrating power tool, or even a form of energy produced inside the pyramid itself, could explain the incredible precision. But no physical evidence of such a machine has ever been discovered at any Egyptian site, and the idea is not accepted by Egyptologists, geologists, or materials scientists. It sits at the edge of the debate, not in the middle of it. That leaves the real question still standing. What, if anything, fills the gap between a simple copper chisel and stonework this precise? That is the question fully addressed by Hancock's theory, and why Joe Rogan remains intrigued by it, even today. Is Hancock wrong about this, or are mainstream scholars hiding a lot from us? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss future uploads. Until next time, take care.